The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. When evening had come, Jesus said to the disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Jesus woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. Jesus said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. The summer before I started seminary, I took a vacation to Charleston, South Carolina, with churches and places of worship in just about every direction you could look, and a skyline dotted by steeples. Charleston's reputation as the holy city, rooted in its history of religious freedom, became readily apparent, and it was a church nerd's dream. During that trip in August of 2014, I visited a lot of churches, but I don't remember if I ever passed by Mother Emanuel, African Methodist Episcopal Church on Calhoun Street. I certainly didn't anticipate then that less than a year later, on June 17th, 2015, Mother Emanuel would so grip the nation's attention as the center of a hate crime that targeted and killed 9 church members gathered for Wednesday evening Bible study. Clementa Pinckney, Cynthia Marie Graham Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lee Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tywanza Sanders, Daniel Lee Simmons, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Myra Thompson. We say their names and remember the Emanuel 9 this day, not just because the ELCA now commemorates them as martyrs on our church calendar every June 17th, though that is important, but perhaps more importantly as a day to reaffirm our commitment to repenting of the sins of racism and white supremacy that led to that horrific act of violence, and to lament the ways that now, 6 years later, racism and race-based violence continue to pervade our world and even our churches. In such moments as one hymn text in our new All Creation Sings hymnal puts it, sometimes our only song is weeping. Sometimes it seems that God is sleeping. The familiar story opens on Jesus with his disciples in a boat. When suddenly the great storm picks up, the waves crash into the boat, and the disciples, many of whom are seasoned fishermen, do everything they know how, desperately splashing water back out of the boat, surely thinking that they would drown. And their teacher, asleep on the job? Do you not care that we are perishing? Then Jesus wakes up, calms the storm, and the miracle story concludes happily ever after. That's the Sunday school version. But what I find most intriguing here is the disciples' question: do you not care that we are perishing? The disciples were afraid of the storm, yes, but also that Jesus might not be able to save them. There's an underlying fear to their question that Jesus might not be who he said he was. This whole following Jesus thing is pretty new in Mark's gospel. They had this fear that maybe they had put their trust in the wrong person. And now what? But that question also presupposes its own answer. Do you not care that we are perishing? Of course, God cares. God cares very much that we are perishing. God cares very much when we are afraid. God cares so much, in fact, that God is right there in the boat, in the midst of the storm with us. So why the question? It would be easy to chalk up the disciples' fear to a lack of faith. But I don't believe for a second that being afraid means we don't have faith. Fear is a natural part of life. Fear is a part of our evolutionary adaptability as humans and can actually keep us alive. There's a tornado warning, for instance, so you go down to the basement. That's normal. Instead, I think that the disciples' question is not so much a question of doubt, but a prayer of lament. In the biblical tradition, lament is not the absence of faith, but quite the opposite. In the words of Psalm 22, the quintessential lament psalm, lament begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me?" as we might expect a lament to do. But it ends with, "In the midst of the assembly I will praise you, for God did not hide God's face from me, but heard me when I cried to God." Lament is not an absence of faith, but testifies to God's abiding presence, despite all evidence to the contrary sometimes. The disciples ask a question that presupposes its own answer. Think about that. The fact that they address this question to Jesus implies that there's something about Jesus worth putting their trust in, even in their fear. That's the gift of lament. We cry out because sometimes it's the only thing that we can do, the only prayer that we have. In the aftermath of unspeakable violence that guns down 9 beloved children of God gathered for Bible study, in the midst of an unfolding pandemic that continues to claim lives in so many parts of the world and changes so much of what we had thought of as normal, in the wake of our own grief and uncertainty and fear in whatever life throws at us. But we also cry out because in the end we know we're not alone. Jesus is in the boat with his disciples in the midst of the storm. They cry out because deep down they know what he can do. Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? Or as one preacher this week rephrases it, why did you doubt that I could save you? Now, I don't so much hear that question as a criticism of the disciples' faith, but rather as an invitation to an even deeper trust, a reminder of who God is and always has been, a reminder of God's power to save. And let me be clear, to have faith does not mean that we are never afraid. To have faith means that we can trust Jesus. We can trust that Jesus is with us. We can trust that Jesus does save us. Not from death, but in death. And I think that preposition is an important distinction. Because Jesus doesn't always take the storm away from us, but Jesus comes to us in the midst of the storm and speaks a word of peace and promise. Faith reminds us that we are not alone. Faith trusts in a God who is in the boat with us and who will bring us through to the other side. Sometimes our only song is weeping. Sometimes it seems that God is sleeping. Yet in the midst of our weeping and our fear and our lament, the hymn goes on. Who hears the song our sorrows swallow and offers hope to calm our fears? When all our words seem frail and hollow, God heeds the prayers within our tears. The miracle of this story is not that Jesus calms the sea. The miracle of this story is that Jesus is in the boat with us and will never leave us.